In 1935, the Bride of Frankenstein lived for only a few minutes. She opened her eyes, screamed, spurned the monster, and vanished for nearly a century. That scream defined her. But now, as the iconic monsters of the 1930s continue to make an appearance in new guises, Dracula lives again and again. One character has been left tantalizingly incomplete: the Bride. This movie poses a question that the original could never answer. What if she lives? We explore the movie genres of sci-fi, horror, action-adventure, prop culture, and all things geek. Hello everyone. This first part of the video is a non-spoiler analysis of The Bride, 2026, just to be clear, written and directed by Maggie Gyllenhaal. We will examine how the movie reworks the Frankenstein legend, how its craftsmanship reworks the legend of creation, and how a cast with a deep history of collaboration brings this new bride to life. Spoilers are clearly indicated later in the video. Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to A Constantly Racing Mind. The Bride retells the classic legend of the Bride of Frankenstein in a rework of the Gothic tale of self-discovery and self-definition. In 1930 Chicago, Frankenstein's monster longs for a companion. Dr. Euphonius assists in the resurrection of a murdered woman. She lives, but rejects both her maker and her proposed husband. The movie turns the legend of monstrosity on its head, from one of fear to one of social isolation. The Bride is feared because she defines ownership, location, and completion. This transformation begins even within the original legend of the creation itself. The 1935 movie featured Dr. Pretorius, a decadent showman who treated the creation of life as a form of entertainment. The 2026 film introduces Dr. Euphonius in his place, named after the ancient artist Euphronios, famous for his lifelike depictions of the human form. Creation shifts from display to creation. The Bride is no longer an accomplishment, she is a being. The tone is more melancholic fairy tale than horror. Love and freedom are at the core. The question shifts from can monsters love to who gets to define what a monster is. The Bride is not made to complete another. She is the one who resists the script. I want to be very clear, at this point we are now going into spoiler territory. So here we go. Give you a few moments, go take off, go watch the movie, come back, watch the review, or go watch my non-spoiler review. So here we go. 3, 2. The film begins with a startling move. Jessie Buckley appears not as the Bride but as Mary Shelley herself. Her ghost narrates the idea that stories never end. They simply wait for someone to continue them. Shelley's spirit drifts into 1930s Chicago and takes up residence in the body of Ida, a working-class woman who had tied to local gangsters, a gun moll. This opening does two things at once. It ties the film directly to the original author of Frankenstein and reframes the Bride as a story Shelley never finished. Ida becomes the vessel through which that unfinished narrative continues. Ida's life in Chicago is defined by the dependence on mobsters and by the limited agency available to women in that world. When Shelley's spirit takes hold of her in a nightclub, Ida suddenly begins speaking with a different voice, accusing the men around her of cruelty and hypocrisy. What sounds like drunken ranting is really the author of Frankenstein forcing truth into a room that normally silences women. The rebellion costs Ida her life. One of the gangsters drags her outside and roughs her up, and she falls down a flight of stairs. The death is accidental but brutal. It leaves behind exactly what Frankenstein's science requires: a freshly dead body. Philosophically, this moment matters because the Bride is not assembled from parts the way the monster traditionally is. She is a woman with a life, a history, and a social context. The resurrection will not erase that history, it will complicate it. Now, the next phase introduces the creation itself. Frank the monster, played by Bale, seeks companionship. One of the most striking elements of the film's mythology appears to be the resurrection process itself. Instead of the familiar lightning and switches laboratory scenes from classic Frankenstein films, this version introduces something stranger: that inky black substance used during the reanimation process. With the help of Dr. Euphonius, played by Annette Bening, he resurrects Ida's body using a strange black tar. The liquid moves through a chandelier of glass tubes before flowing into the bride's body. The mark runs from her neck down her chest and arms, a visual reminder that the act of creation never fully disappears. When she wakes, the substance stains her permanently, leaving dark streaks across her skin. The stain isn't just a visual effect, it becomes part of her identity, almost like a mark of creation. The bride emerges disoriented at first, almost childlike. Think of that other bride film with Emma Stone, Poor Things. But that confusion doesn't last long. The character quickly evolves into a fierce, articulate presence, whose anger and independence begin to drive the story. What's also interesting is that the bride appears to awaken without memory of her previous life. She doesn't remember being Ida. Instead, she experienced reoccurring visions of Mary Shelley, the author who imagined Frankenstein. That detail makes the character feel layered. The bride isn't just a resurrected body, she becomes a figure caught between three identities. The woman she once was, the monster who created her, and the author who first conceived her. The result is less a traditional horror creature and more a character struggling to decide who she is allowed to be. Christian Bale's version of Frankenstein's monster seems driven by loneliness rather than rage. He resurrects the bride, hoping to build a life with someone who might understand him. Don't we all? But the creation begins with a lie. Frank tells the revived bride that they were once engaged and that a tragic accident separated them. The story is meant to bind her emotionally to him. It hides the truth of Ida's previous life and replaces it with a fictional past. This deception becomes the central philosophical tension of the film. The bride's identity is constructed not just through science but through narrative. She has been given a false story about who she is. The bride eventually rejects the role she has been assigned. Her defining phase becomes a quiet refusal. I prefer not to. That line echoes Herman Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener, in which a clerk undermines authority simply by declining to comply. The bride does not revolt through violence. She rejects expectations. Instead of settling into domestic life with Frank, she moves into Chicago's nightlife, dancing, drinking, exploring the city's underworld. The film treats this choice less as a rebellion and more as self-discovery. The bride is learning who she might be outside of the script written for her. However, this is not the life Frank had imagined they would have together. Instead, his ideal with her was shaped by fantasy, specifically the glamorous movie musicals he watches obsessively. Those films star Ronnie Reed, a fictional tap-dancing matinee idol in the vein of Fred Astaire, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Reed represents everything Frank cannot be: elegant, admired, and effortlessly human. Through those movies, Frank learns what love is supposed to look like. However, Frank's imagination introduces a surreal thread. In moments of isolation, he imagines musical numbers in which he and the bride appear as stars in Reed's films. These sequences reveal the monster's longing for a world where he can belong. They also add a strange dreamlike tone to the narrative, blurring the line between reality and fantasy, which makes his attempt to build a relationship with the bride feel both hopeful and tragic. He's trying to recreate something he has only ever seen on a screen. Once the bride finds her voice, the story shifts into something much wilder. The pair move through Chicago in a chaotic, rebellious partnership that blends romance and violence. Their actions bring them into conflict with the police and turn them into fugitives. The bride is that crazy girlfriend. At the same time, the bride's defiance begins to inspire other women. Her refusal to accept the role assigned to her spreads outward, transforming her into something larger than a single character. She becomes a symbol. The turning point comes in an underground club, where two men harass her. Frank intervenes violently. The confrontation leaves bodies behind and turns the pair into fugitives. At this point, the film shifts tone into something resembling a Bonnie-and-Clyde story. Frank and the bride move through Chicago as outlaws. The pursuit is led by Detective Jake Wiles, played by Peter Sarsgaard. Instead of a simple villain, Wiles appears to be written as a complicated figure, someone trying to reconcile his duty with growing awareness that the world he represents may not be entirely just. His partner in the investigation is Myrna Mallow, played by Penelope Cruz. Officially, she's his secretary, or at the time known as a Girl Friday. In practice, she's the one doing the intellectual work behind the case. She eventually demands recognition for her work. Her struggle mirrors the bride's own. Both women are trying to step out from under the identities imposed on them by men and institutions. The film quietly presents Myrna as another kind of bride, a woman resisting the role written for her. Their flight across the city mirrors the classic monster chase structure, but with an important reversal. In older horror films, the monster is hunted because it threatens society. Here, the bride is hunted for refusing the social role she was assigned. As the bride's reputation spreads through the city, she becomes more than just a fugitive. Women begin imitating her stark appearance and her refusal to obey traditional expectations. The bride evolves into a symbol. What began as one woman rejecting a lie becomes a cultural ripple effect. The character transformed from creature into myth. And what stands out most about the film's design is the way it blends so many tones. Gothic horror, romantic tragedy, gangster crime story, musical fantasy. It's an unusual mix, but it fits the larger idea the film seems to be exploring. Identity is messy, contradictory, and rarely confined to a single role. Now, Frank is a cautious man who is constantly aware of his sense of not belonging. Although his need for companionship is genuine, the story's central problem stems from his misinterpretation of love. He believes he can win her affection indefinitely if he creates a partner. She, the bride, believes that love must be freely chosen. The film's dramatic conclusion is fueled by this misconception. The emotional struggle between Frank and the bride reaches a crescendo in the film's final act. The bride is aware of her identity and her goals at this point in the film. She will be more than just a solution to someone else's loneliness. The result is a tension she creates between her expectations and those of the people around her. Frank faces the dilemma of loving the bride while aware of the possibility of losing her. Now, Frank and the bride's relationship reaches a breaking point in the film's dramatic last moments. Frank must realize that love cannot exist without the other person's free will, and he understands this fallacy in attempting to keep the bride by his side. But because she truly loves the man, the bride decides to stay with him. The film's conclusion is nuanced but not flawless. The bride and Frank have a genuine but shaky connection. Both of the people in the film are outsiders in their own world, which has yet to come to terms with them. However, they can acknowledge their affections for one another and commit to remaining together forever. The film's conclusion is both tragic, romantic, and somewhat uplifting. The bride reminds me of that crazy girlfriend that you can't live with and you can't live without. Mary Shelley didn't invent her ideas in isolation. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, the philosopher who wrote a Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. Wollstonecraft argued that women were treated as if they were naturally inferior, when in reality society had simply denied them the freedom to define themselves. Shelley grew up in the shadow of that argument. Her mother died shortly after giving birth to her, but the ideas remained. When Shelley wrote Frankenstein, she told a story about creating life and then abandoning responsibility for it. If the bride is really asking what happens when the created woman refuses the role written for her, then in a strange way, the film isn't just continuing Mary Shelley's story, it's echoing the philosophical legacy she inherited from her mother. When you see the Warner Brothers shield before the titles of the bride, there's a flicker of cognitive dissonance. For nearly a century, Frankenstein and his bride have been the crown jewels of Universal Pictures. So how did Maggie Gyllenhaal's vision end up across town? The answer begins with the 2023 strikes and the shifting tide at Netflix. This was originally a Netflix project, but as the budget climbed toward $80 million, eventually crossing the $100 million mark with reshoots, Netflix walked away. They chose instead to consolidate their bets on Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein adaptation. Enter Michael DeLuca and Pam Abdi at Warner Brothers, who saw an opportunity to rescue a prestige gamble that everyone else was calling too risky. But what about Universal? Why aren't they protecting their most famous monsters? The reality is that Frankenstein's monster is a creature of two worlds, the literary and the visual. Mary Shelley's 1818 novel is in the public domain, meaning the name Frankenstein and the core concept of a reanimated corpse are free for anyone to use. However, Universal still holds the copyright to the archetypal image, the flat top head, the neck bolts, and that specific shade of green skin. By setting the bride in a grimy punk rock 1930s Chicago and swapping bolts for inky black resurrection tar, Gyllenhaal and Warner Brothers have executed a clever legal sidestep. They managed to evoke the classic Gothic atmosphere without touching Universal's trademarked iconography. It's a move that transforms the character from a studio property back into what was always meant to be, a myth that belongs to everyone. Maggie Gyllenhaal's film career has consistently dealt with women living in the shadow of expectation and struggling to break free. From secretary to kindergarten teacher to her directorial debut in The Lost Daughter, her films investigate identity living under social engineering. The Bride continues this line of inquiry into mythology. The most iconic constructed woman in horror is now one of refusal rather than completion. Gyllenhaal has said that The Bride is a woman made for another who must find her voice, a statement against the imposition of perfection. The film is less a monster reboot and more a reclaiming. The bride moves from object in Frankenstein's tale to a subject of her own. Maggie Gyllenhaal is the director and writer of The Bride, and she structures the story from the perspective of refusal and internal experience, rather than desire. Cinematography is handled by Lawrence Sher. Employing sculpted light and social isolation framing, it's an expressionist noir. Dylan Tretchenor is the editor. His editing enables encounters and reactions to build identity rather than propel the plot. The music composer is Hildur Gudnadóttir, I know I said that close because I heard her say it herself, who engages physical interior soundscapes that reinforce ideas of living tissue in manufactured form, whose work include Joker and A Haunting in Venice. The craft team collectively reinterprets Frankenstein creation as existential experience rather than horror incident. This cast is not a random prestige casting. Many have crossed paths in creative endeavors before, consulting a community of shared tone and performance language. Jessie Buckley and Maggie Gyllenhaal worked on The Lost Daughter. Buckley has already played Fractured Identity under Gyllenhaal's direction. Jessie Buckley and Hildur worked together on the film Women Talking. They were shared collaborators on the award circuit. Both artists are known for interior emotional topographies. Jessie Buckley joins The Bride at a career height marked by women defined by loss, projection, and imposed identity. This work is focused on a woman whose interior world redefines cultural myth itself. The death of her son is an emotional germ of Hamlet. Grief in creation, identity born of loss. These are exactly the emotional topographies that underlie The Bride. Buckley has called Hamnet life-changing, underlying the depth of emotional vulnerability the character demanded. And importantly, she shot The Bride just prior to filming Hamnet, noting that the openness and availability of The Bride has bled over into Agnes. The 1935 Bride had no agency. Buckley's current career is founded on the presence of interior voice under duress. Her Hamnet Award also shifts the reception of the character. She comes not as a horror casting, but as an actress known for emotional truth and mythological womanhood. Christian Bale and Peter Sarsgaard work in prestige drama circles, The Dark Knight, overlapping industry spheres. Both are actors known for psychological realism in heightened worlds. Now, with Bale as Frankenstein's monster, shows his film career has consistently explored identity inscribed upon flesh. Few leading actors have used physical transformation as regularly to convey psychology. This makes him uniquely qualified to play Frankenstein's monster, a figure whose flesh is literally constructed history. Over the years, Bale's acting career has consistently used the body as narrative text, transformed, conditioned, damaged, or rebuilt to reflect inner turmoil. The monster is at the beginning of this line. His through line, relevant to The Bride, The Machinist, gaunt body constructed by guilt and disassociation. Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, split identity between self and symbol. The Fighter, physical destruction and addiction. Vice, a physical transformation into a political figure. In each instance, Bale portrays the self as something constructed, often destructively, by external forces. This corresponds exactly to Frankenstein's life, a self-made, not born. Whereas Buckley tends to play women fighting against imposed identity, Bale tends to play men caught up in roles they are forced to play. Bruce Wayne must become Batman. Trevor Resnick becomes the flesh of his guilt. Dick Cheney becomes the flesh of power. The monster follows suit, a male figure whose existence is determined by how others view and fear him, rather than self-definition. Thus, the casting represents a thematic couplet. Buckley, self-emerging from construction. Bale, self-imprisoned within construction. Bride and monster, opposite identity trajectories. Bale and Gyllenhaal, prior mythic coupling. Christian Bale and Maggie Gyllenhaal respectively played Bruce Wayne and Rachel Dawes in The Dark Knight. Their coupling is organized around the tropes of impossible idealization, the women as embodiment of moral wholesomeness, which the hero can never, ever attain. Then there's Peter Sarsgaard as Detective Jake Wiles. Sarsgaard's on-screen presence is one of controlled authority facing instability. He has played men situated within systems of law, medicine, media, and military who are confronted with something they cannot fully grasp or control. This makes him a natural fit for the role of social order, facing the unclassifiable bride. His casting is also a personal note, as Sarsgaard is Maggie Gyllenhaal's husband and longtime collaborator. He acts within a world created by his wife. Again, a real-world creator-observer relationship that quietly reflects the film's preoccupation with who controls whom. In fact, his career is relevant to the bride. In Boys Don't Cry, he deals with violent enforcement of gender norms. Shattered Glass, institutional trust facing fabrication. Kinsey, scientific authority mapping identity. The Skeleton Key, occult transfer identity from body to body. The Batman, corrupted legal authority. Memory, moral authority undermined by trauma. The Skeleton Key is particularly apt. The movie centers on transfer of consciousness from body to body and the fear of losing possession of oneself, fundamental fears that underlie the Frankenstein myth. Sarsgaard's inclusion in this tradition places him squarely within horror films that address the question of who possesses the body and who controls it. Jake Gyllenhaal and Maggie Gyllenhaal, Donnie Darko of course, sibling actors now find themselves in a director-actor capacity, reflecting the relationship between creator and creation. It's 2026 and we're well into the 21st century, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has now lived for more than 200 years. For nearly half that time, filmmakers have been reinterpreting the story for the screen. Each generation reshapes the myth in its own way. The Bride is no exception. So if you walk into the film expecting a traditional horror movie, you may be surprised. There are certainly grotesque and unsettling moments, but horror is not really the point. Like Luc Besson's recent take on Dracula, this film leans closer to the creature Mary Shelley imagined rather than the silent Karloff monster that shaped our cultural memory. Shelley's creature was thoughtful, emotional, and painfully aware of his place in the world. After wandering the earth since 1818 or 1819, depending on how you date the novel's publication, the creature eventually adopted the name of his creator, Frankenstein. And just like in the original Bride of Frankenstein, he is still searching for love. What Maggie Gyllenhaal does here is bring that search into a modern context. The film blends gothic imagery, social exile, romance, and identity into something that feels closer to a tragic love story than a monster movie. And yes, this film will be controversial for some viewers. It is not quite horror, it's not quite a comedy, it's not a musical, yet there are comedic moments, grotesque body horror imagery, and even dance sequences that somehow make sense within the story's world. Mary Shelley is often credited as the founder of science fiction, but this story feels more alchemical than scientific. Creation here is less about electricity and laboratories and more about transformation, emotional, social, and personal. Once the film reveals its full direction, the influences become clearer. You can feel echoes of Young Frankenstein, Bonnie-and-Clyde, and even Sid and Nancy. There's a rebellious outsider energy running through the story that gives it a strange charm. Hildur Gudnadottir's score helps push that tone. The music blends 1930s jazz and swing with something rougher, almost punk in spirit. It creates a strange but interesting emotional texture that fits the film's misfit characters. Overall, I like the film. I like the energy, I like the story, and I especially like Jessie Buckley and Christian Bale. Both bring real emotion to their roles, and you generally feel for them. The only performance that didn't fully land for me was Peter Sarsgaard's Detective Jake Wiles. The character sometimes comes across more mopey than world-weary, and that subplot may run a little longer than necessary in a 126-minute film. Still, the core story works. At the center of everything, it's a simple human idea. Two outsiders trying to understand themselves and each other in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with them. And that emotional core is what ultimately makes the film work. So again, The Bride lands for me at 4 out of 5. A quick note before I go. About 30 seconds into the credits are some additional scenes that hint at the world that The Bride and Frank have created. So if you enjoyed the review, check out the channel's other monster film discussions, including my recent breakdown of Dracula. And if you want to support the channel, the ACRM merch store is now live with designs inspired by the ideas that we explore here. Also, a quick shout out to RunP, one of the best apps for moviegoers. If you ever need to step out during a film, RunP tells you the safest moments to go without missing anything important. Thanks for watching, and remember, the best monsters aren't the ones that scare us. They're the ones that remind us what it means to be human.